There is rarely something more enthusing when I teach than when a student presents to me the Beethoven Sonata Opus 101. Oh, 101! I've lived with it like most of us for the decades that we grow up in music with a partnership of this sonata that remains gently mysterious, elegantly intense, and generally complex in the simplicity where you have to integrate so much in order to bring out the essence of it with all the ingredients that blend into it. And so when a student brings me this sonata, I go back to, of course, my, like most teachers do, memories of discovering it myself the first time, and then living with it through. It's in 6/8, so you have to think of the second and the fifth beat because you play on the first, most of the time, third, fourth, and six first. Ta-dum, ta-dum, 3, 4, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. And the 2 and 5, Beethoven rarely writes it, so you hold it. While you hold it, you have a decay in the sound. And since allegretto is not really allegro because it's ma non troppo, as indication of emotion rather than, of course, factual tempo, since there is no metronome indication. It's more hasted than an andante, but not completely driven like an allegro. So he has an opening movement that is a false slow movement. And the long short pulse balance of the quarter eighth notes gives a sense of incredible, almost cradling. But not musically, because musically string quartet intense. So, la, si, do, mi, re, si, violin 1. Mi, si, fa, sol, mi, la, fa, si, sol. Violin 2 in the layer under in the first bar. Then the viola, mi, re, re, do, si, mi, with its chromatic scale going down. And the cello, mi, holding the ostinato note. And all this on the dominant. Probably, as I like to assume, that it's connected to the German syntax in literature, which is the verb comes at the end of the sentence. And here you'll know only at the end of the movement you're in A major. So you're sort of barless, sort of tonicless. You're left by Beethoven in this delicious moment of intense ambiguity of the beat, the downbeat, no downbeat, displaced syncopations. You can see where Schumann learned a lot about his chain syncopations, unsettled. But of course, in slower tempo, the unsettlement becomes its own downbeat because you have no downbeat to correspond to it, to prove that you're offbeat, at least one of the two hands. Here it's both hands, and you stay in a semblance of a stagnant section, but in fact it's moving, except for the eyes. When you look at the score, you see it's ta-hum, 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 and you hear it ta-da, ti-da-da. Of course, if you play an instrument like the violin, the bowing, strings choose according to the beams of the phrase how to change the direction of the bow when. So, la, si, do, mi, re, si, by 2 bars. La, la, sol, fa, mi, do, si, 2 bars. And then we have 4. So, la, si, do, mi, re, do, because the modulation starts into the dominant or secondary, dominant, because the bass line has gone into deceptive cadence. And then you go do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, re, do, fa, sol, la, mi, re, do. See, I had to breathe. That's wrong. I should have organized so that in the exhaling I can do a bridge on 4 bars rather than 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars. Of course, I'm not a wind player, obviously, so I'm not worried. And the pianist can play as slow as they unnaturally wish. It can become some kind of a meditational exercise. So, la, la, si, do, mi, re, si. But if you play in chamber music, let's say, with strings or winds or accompany a singer, you have to go faster, and to go faster but keep calm on the surface of the lake, mirror style, while so much is going on in the inner voices. You have to have a capacity to play from close up, deep in the keys, to avoid unexpected accents, therefore to have that sense of peaceful calm, gentleness, while playing all the notes in a dynamic range that doesn't scream. It's mostly interior, Sehnsucht, within, looking inside yourself. Sort of a interiorized opening. Not humbly timid, perhaps a little bit shy in the sense of artistic shyness, not at once expressing all its emotional drive, is suddenly he does in F sharp minor, do, fa, sol, la, si, re, do, lo. And you realize that this peaceful theme becomes with a minor ninth, oh my god, dramatic, and then contrasting D major in echo, la, re, do, la, and then la, mi, re, la, and then do, sol, fa, do, and then re, sa, fa, si, do. So he goes all the way to B minor, and then he interrupts everything in an angry 2 bars, with staccato octaves opposite direction, as if the storytelling reached a breaking point after not reaching the fulfilling climax, but rather run-on sentence expression of the melodic line, and without to talk of the other voices. So by the time you think about it, like I explained it, it sounds like you have to manage, combine, organize, and therefore carry forward the storytelling of the melodic line, the polyphonic dialogue of the different inner lines of the second violin and the viola, a little bit of the cello, but not so as well. It depends of the sections. In other words, if he had chosen to accompany it with a melody and accompaniment, of course, would be rudimentary simple. If he writes it without accompaniment, is that all the parts are equally important, even if they're so different, but superimposed, layered. And then you have the pulse, the slow motion that is flowing from the eighth note to the quarter note, ta-dum, 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 but without to rush. And then take in account for the tempo how long the quarter note's decay will be before the eighth note comes as a release of it, in which case you do dum, ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. The slower you play, the more you decay, the more you pick up the eighth note after the quarter note softer, so you cannot finish the sentence without to whisper or not be heard. And if you take the accent or the impulse articulation of the quarter note for the eighth note that follows after the decay of the quarter note, then you have ta, ta, da, ta, da, ta, da, an impulsive accent which chops it to pieces. I mean, obviously you have to have a continuous phrase as if it was written in equal notes. Sol, la, si, do, mi, re, si, la, sol, fa, mi, do, si. But sol, la, si, do, mi. And when you sing, you sustain your quarter note. You don't go sol, la, si, do, mi, which is what the piano does. Well, relatively less than that, but still, according to acoustics and instruments. And then to manage all the voices, you have to think. A string quartet, after all, 4 brains try to merge into one. Whenever the pianist playing a string quartet texture like this, it's really a pianist dividing his thoughts in 5. 4, well, 5 perhaps even sometimes, because he adds extra voices to the 4 for some moments of punctuation. So dividing is not as easy, because then you cannot follow all, or then you have to organize yourself to follow all without to lose the main one. And then I was thinking this beautiful necessity of Beethoven to be unsettled in this first movement, falsely calm, falsely unsettled, and in fact in an enormous tension release, harmonically speaking, from a dominant that goes through various series of cadences that don't go to the tonic harmonically when the melodic line goes to the A of the tonality is tonic. but he goes through a series of secondary dominants, and of course primarily delays the perfect cadence into the tonic harmonically by doing all these deceptive cadences. So while it's harmonically tense, while it's rhythmically ambiguous at best and touchingly delayed, sometimes tender and sometimes extended, you feel like as an opening sonata mood, it's very difficult to define how calm is calm, how slow is too slow, how not too slow but calm can be a solution if you can control the touch of the dynamics and the voicings by playing them faster deep in the keys from close up in order to have the motion without the commotion. And that's the whole point, because the pianist wanting to control, they play slow in order to play slow and soft. If not, they play slow but not soft, or with unexpected accents, and then it sounds busy or at best surprisingly uneven. So easy to say. Every time I teach it, I try to summarize it better. How to, in a way, marry elements: the singing, the legato, the tempo, the pedal, the phrasing as a direction or as an articulation or both. When he does mi, fa, sol, la with the drop of the seventh, instead of going mi, fa, sol, la on the second rising, he has this slur for the 3/8 notes, and under it you have a slur for 2 plus 1 staccato. But because of the direction of the 3 plus the articulation of 2 and 1 in the same, you have to define if that staccato is not really a tenuto, and you become mi, fa, sol, la. And if acoustics allow, with some resonance, it'll be mi, fa, sol, la. But it's not mi, fa, sol, la. Because the staccato alone is more than a length or shortness of the rhythmic pattern. It talks about, it invokes, it carries some character of fun. And when you're in such a meditative state in this opening, this staccato appears factually right, but mood-wise, I think it's a tenuto. Mi, fa, sol, la. Which is why he has that double beam, one for the 3/8 notes, and under it one for 2 plus 1. And that, to translate for the student, first of all, it's contradictory. Then you understand that one is direction, the other one is phrasing, and therefore articulation. Then you come to the fingering, and then you come to the tempo. Do I take some ritenuto to mean it well? When he has a subito forte and then subito piano, then the chords that come after the forte are in the resonance of the forte, so you feel like delaying a bit and adding in 7th out of 6/8 notes a bar for that bar, and then the structure is gone. If it's orchestrated, then of course it's by sections like brass, winds, and strings, and it flows into the beats, but the different components either sometimes, yes, over-resonate. We have to accept it when you play it, that the subito piano won't be heard fully at the get-go. It will emerge after the 2nd or 3rd eighth note holding it. So these are counterintuitive dynamics when you build a crescendo and then almost forte subito piano and no ritenuto. Mi, fa, sol, la was the staccato that denies the staccato, and this si, do, re, mi, fa, re, do, si. Of course, explaining it to oneself or to a student doesn't really mean much compared to experiencing it when you play it. Because playing it means anticipate it. Listening to it means following it. Reading the score, listening to it, if you can, with the score, is noticing details that you don't hear in the performance, because the performer chooses to bring something and some other things not, willingly, unwillingly. So the question comes down to, do we read the score, or do we hear the random, it's not random, the partial expression of all the elements, either by choice of hierarchy, the melody, the secondary voice, and the bass, or the way it came out, basically. So you can plan, organize, copy by hand, sing voice by voice, imagine it in different settings and directions of positions on the staff, and then you play it like it's written. And it's supposed to be not the ingredients, but the cooked food. And you taste the ingredients, but combined, and the balances in these combinations. All these analogies to tastes, to colors, to perhaps textures, yeah, they're very talking for a student. They understand that because we're all human. We experience pain, hope, longing, despair, sadness, excitement. We taste something sweet, but bitter, or both. So we know how to relate to a smell because we experience different smells of flowers. And you can always say, oh, well, Beethoven was, and he was deaf, or at least very impaired for his hearing. When towards the end of his life, he wrote these of the last few sonatas he wrote. And you wonder, as I do, would have he written it differently had he not been deaf? It's an impossible question to answer. One can justify some of those extreme ranges in the piano because of that. Otherwise, one can say, but anyway, that is what he hears within himself, even if he doesn't hear things from outside in anymore. But he heard them earlier, the nature, sounds, or the other pieces, compositions of other people. I don't know how much he heard. I mean, he played some Mozart and all, but Bach probably too. The point is that, yes, he perhaps writes the music. Fauré does that too in the end of his life, since he also became deaf during his compositional long life. Well, Beethoven didn't live as long, but in both cases, you can see a shift in the aesthetics of the projection of the moods. It's more without gloves when you're older and deaf. So it's not that he's not seductive or not trying to be charming or not trying to be polite and embedding the message inside this politeness, which is what Haydn does, what Mozart does. But Beethoven is more raw when he's older in his expression of his aesthetic. Doesn't try to be consensual and explaining, and no, certainly not. He just goes for it. And so, in a way, it's difficult to try not to make it likable. In a way, it's not meant by him to be likable. It's meant to be meaningful. He goes directly to the heart of things. He doesn't take introductions and he doesn't take manners. He just goes for it. And so you have a dissonance that is screaming, or you have a consonance that is soothing, but they are meant more not for tension release purposes or expression of emotion. I think they're meant to be part of the thought process. It's like you hear his thinking through his playing, through his music being played. Of course, he's not playing it himself. So how much we reduce it to our hearing or through the funnel of our psyche, it's a question of point of view, obviously. How can we hear it like he heard it, innerly speaking? How can we translate what he innerly imagined in all the structural combinations of sounds? We have pitches, rhythms, pulse, pedal, phrasing, direction, group of bars, tempo, general mood, and detailed surprises of the build-up of crescendo towards a climax that is denied, an escape that drops, or a crescendo that drops to piano, and how much that should be dramatically overstated or just rightfully stated into mezzo forte or into fortissimo. After all, there is a margin of personal experience with the instrument of the performer playing it in real time, despite of following as truly as possible, I mean, as trustfully as possible, as trustworthy as possible into the score. That's what I meant. So of course you have to be artistically involved, inspired by the piece to inspire the audience through the piece. But at the same time, it's the piece that you play, not your inspiration of the piece. That shouldn't overwhelm the interpretation, but it does in a way that you're there. You incarnate the score that is only dead notes on the page. You bring them alive, and there's so many ways to organize them. Even if we are faithful to the score, there's still ways to reorganize them, more or less staccato, more or less legato, more or less overlapping legato, the tempo, the acoustic, the instrument, so many parameters. And then at the end, the piece comes up or out of our performance. It exists by itself anyway. But I find that it's beautiful that we can have a moment to reflect over it. And perhaps you visit it 3 years later or 10 years later and 20 years later, etc. And every time you hear a little more things, or you are able to think a little more things while you play it, without to try to not forget everything you are taught to do at the same time, because there's so many elements to bring together. And you always feel like I'm forget some. I remember lessons with Mademoiselle. I go out of the lesson thinking, how will I ever play any piece of these, whatever we worked on? Because I genuinely thought I'll never be able to remember all the ingredients she mentioned in the very detailed way of working on a few bars of a very rich texture of a piece. And that's before you make it into a sentence, into a phrase, into a movement. We speak about organizing the details and being aware of them by hearing them, singing them, playing them, even writing them, and then performing them in a way that they come out as if they're read through your hearing into the audience playing. So in other words, an intelligent, intuitive, constructed and learned or appropriated text that becomes yours while you say it, even if it's not yours. And you're respectful of the one that's there. But at all levels, from the tiniest detail to the complete movement, you have to be in sort of an ambivalent state. All details, and then at the same time, the breadth of the whole piece. So you're sort of your own stage manager, and declaiming the text, and organizing the breathing, how much you space the words in order to create a dramatic effect, or how much they need to be as written, colliding with each other by a dynamic range that is erasing one from the other. It's an incredible challenge, and at the same time great pleasure to teach every time this piece, because every time the student's capacity of absorption of these elements, agree or disagree with them, just absorbing them in order to let them settle in and then be able to be performed, it's a mystery to me. Not that I appreciate pleasing students more than those who take longer to integrate it and perhaps not play it in a pleasing way to me, or the way I think it should be played, because I think that my ultimate goal is for them to play it the way they hear it, and give them the technical capacity to that's why I keep asking them, how do you hear it? How do you feel it? How do you understand it? make them play one part, sing another, or make them count the off beats or the beats they don't play while they play the beats, realizing that it is very challenging to do, but it gives them clues to how to organize their own peregrination through all these textures. And then every student reacts differently to the piece in terms of what you reveal to them or what they already realized into it, and how much you can help them put it together, basically. And ultimately live with it until they manage to have the flow and the detail and the expression and all these elements naturally fitting, or at least rightfully fitting, not overstated, not understated, not shy or held back, not over hovered and overexpressed, just the right tone for the right tasteful presentation of it. Tasteful to the taste of mine, obviously, as a teacher, and I guess theirs too. But sometimes their choice, for instance, of tempo is because they feel they don't have the technique to prepare faster how to play soft. It takes longer to prepare each note soft, so because it takes longer, then they take a slower tempo. Then it's a question about overall expression of the tempo or technical management of the tempo. So I can sculpt and shape it according to what I sense here attentively is their own yearning into it. Fascinating. And ever challenging. There is that elegance in the opening on the dominant of the Sonata Opus 101 by Beethoven, where you have the melodic line sol, la, si, do, mi, re, si. Mostly step motion, but you have this elegant appoggiatura going around the D through the E for the melody, and before the leap of the octave, and then another drop by step motion, and then the middle voice mi, si, fa, sol, mi, la, fa, si, sol. Of course, if you hear it above each other, compared to, and then the chromaticism of the viola and the tenuto of the ostinato of the cello. The deceptive cadence, which continues the melodic line from dropping to bridge over. And there is the 2 and 1 with the tenuto rather than with the staccato, or the 3 connected for the direction, but for the phrasing 2 and 1. That means not dropping melodically, yes, but not dynamically, because if not, it would have been. But the dropping of the 7th and the answer with the inversion, it's so elegantly dialogued. First by 3rd, by 4th, by the 6th, and then by the octave. And that incredible, almost escaped, which he probably didn't want to, couldn't anyway, with the range of the instrument. I had to drop in So that fragmented orchestration on the piano, strings compared to winds, for instance, in the orchestra, without delay. And then the delayed syncopation without downbeat. And finally, the theme so radiant in A major on the dominant beat, so dramatic with a minor ninth in F sharp minor, and then interrupted by an echo in D major. Then relative minor of that B minor. And these two bars of anger. And the downbeat that follows half note, dotted half note, subito piano. So orchestral, so fragmented, and not necessarily adjustable to hear the downbeat piano before the resonance of the forte of the sixth beat preceding goes away. So you don't want to do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, just to hear it on the downbeat. He probably wanted that to overlap. Of course, acoustics, resonance, pay an account. And the tempo matters so much because if it's played in equal values, but that doesn't function in 6/8. We have a long and a short, a quarter and an eighth note. With an elan, a momentum from the short to the long, it doesn't start on an upbeat. It starts on the downbeat. But the next phrase after the second two group bar phrase is with an upbeat leap for the octave. Again, two bar beats with a deceptive cadence, and now the 4 bars. And as far as the tempo is concerned, of course you could think of it as a meditational, non-instrumental, singable, or without, of course, the text, just to play. Just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. Because, of course, it loses that natural flow of the 6/8, short, long, long, short. It has to be gentle, elegant, flowing, but not rushed nor accented, and without asperities. And if it takes more time to secure each beat, each note's sound quality, then the tempo becomes the touch one can control, and if one can control it from close up in the keys, deep inside, in a faster tempo, then it feels that the pulse is faster, but the important is to keep that sense of serene mood. Serene moderato, serene allegro, serene allegretto regarding. I think the only justification is that you have the arching that leads gently to the arrival point that you set yourself, which is this. stretched. Second subphrase. And then third phrase. And then, of course, if you take into account the decay of the quarter note, then the eighth note should be played at the level of that dropped decay. Then the next downbeat becomes softer. Then the next following eighth note has to be even softer according to its decay of the quarter note. And then, so you end up by having a huge decrescendo to avoid, which is unwillingly accented because we keep in mind singing it sol, la, si, do, mi. We don't sing it sol, la, si, do, mi. So in denial of the resonance of the piano for the decay of the long value, we might want to play a little louder, but without to be too loud in order to keep that serene feeling, the melodic note, and incorporate between the quarter notes the eighth note that is a connector, a bridge between the beats. So ultimately, the tempo is chosen by the way you use the pulse to organize the flow. Is it with passing tones, or all combined, each note meaningful regardless of its hierarchy of importance compared to the structural notes or the decorative passing tone notes. It starts on the dominant, but it stays on the dominant. The deceptive cadence. Strictly string quartet texture is so striking. You can follow them constantly, the cello and the violin, doing this incredible shrinking to the center of the keys. And then after that you reach the two endings of the keyboard. So there's so much in mind in Beethoven about the dispositions, the ranges, and therefore the mood that it creates, an intimacy and interior feeling of self-search, in then something very spread and stretched. There is so much humanity, so much gentleness, so much intensity, so much... the mood of this opening, I think, is still reflective and gentle, with few bursts of this F sharp minor and this C sharp minor abrupt chords, and then it returns to that gentleness throughout. I think it's like a great meditation upon the dominant into the tonic, some kind of meditation of the tension to the release, the end of the sentence, the verb in German. But constantly follow the voices. Mi, si, fa, sol. So play 3, sing 1. Mi, si, fa, sol, mi, la, fa, si, sol, sol, la, si, do, mi, si, mi, re, do, si, mi. And of course, mi. And then that's ridiculous. I'm sorry, I'm making a fool of myself. But at least you think them. If you don't have to sing them in the pitch, I think it's right to sing them, just to speak them even. If you do la la sol fa mi do si sol la si do mi re do re mi fa sol la si sharp, B sharp, re do fa sol la mi re do si re fa mi si do si la sol fa mi re mi si la sol. The fact that you can say it, even if you can't sing it, obviously in my case, but the point of the story, I think, is that if you can say it while playing the others, is that you don't need to only have the muscular memory of the playing, the industry of playing, to remember the layer, and not only as a group of voices chordally organized, but in their entirety, the flow of each of the four parts of the quartet voicing. I think it's a fundamental way to separate the playing from the hearing from the thinking, hearing how to think, organize the flow of the events. If you do the same thing with the middle voice, la 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 mi si fa sol mi la so si la I si do mi fa now, excuse me. And the reason I like to think of music like that is because I think that Beethoven heard it like that when he wrote it. He didn't write this beautiful melody and have an accompaniment. Of course not. It's not an accompaniment with melody. It's really four voices. Okay, not all of them primary importance, but still the inner voices mean a lot. Even if you have common tones, the B for the dropping of the middle voice, of the alto, let's say, or second violin, and the melody of the top soprano, first violin. And because I think it's a constant flow of a melodic line arched for further, I don't want to diminish here, but bridge through until this deceptive cadence, and then flow. So of course, the more you play and you replay and you practice, the more you hear and you listen, you sing, you play, you write, you sing, you organize, you basically become the piece, from the detail to the whole, from every individual gesture to the general direction of the line. And this immersion in the text is very important, because it gives us a lot of information about, while we play it, how the composer imagined the next bar or next group of bars. Of course, in my teaching, I like to say the alternative, in case we want to doubt that he didn't do the right choice, which of course he didn't, we know he did. But for instance, when we have this dropping, and why not compared to and so course, none of these are convincing, and I don't intend them to be, but I let free flow myself in the ideas of where else it could have gone. For instance, after the first two, we know it's in dominant to dominant, then subdominant, then dominant. So then he goes to the sixth degree for the deceptive cadence. What if he went to the dominant of dominant? With imitation and modulation in 505. And then, of course, he has to go at some point to the tonic, even if he delays the resolutions. Keeping the elegance and the dialogue. Okay, that's another delirium. But now if I go back to the single note idea of practicing the expression instead of, or so I can play the left hand like written, but on a single melodic note with the expression of the crescendo, diminuendo, long, short, pulse, rhythm, harmonic motion, as well as melodic direction, but discipline to be as expressive on a single note. And then you play like it's written. And you really appreciate the importance of that leap. You don't take it for granted. You start playing with different directions of the way of the levels of the voicings. Teaching this piece reopens the Pandora's box of the options. How many? And then you choose one, and you choose his, and you choose his phrasing, his articulation, his direction, his pulse, his line, his surprises in terms of longer phrase structure without per se a climax, and then a run-on sentence which brings you to a further section, and at the end you only have the resolution of the long dominant Teutonic first movement, tension release. It happens at so many levels that it's so fascinating how to count it, how to bring it, how to say it rather than sing it, how to mean it rather than only mood it. I mean, it's mood and it's a feeling, but it's also something very expressively said. Like a bird soaring in the sky and not dropping yet, fully. That extension. Legato, not over legato, but spoken. This kind of breath to have in order to play it in that flow with all these elements that blend without to stick out and without missing any of them. One day. But we'll keep trying.